Hi, everyone. It's good to be back. So, I want to apologize for my lengthy hiatus, but there's a good reason, and I'll just be brief. So, I live here in Pahonix, and some days I have to work outside, not every day, but some days I have to be in the field, more or less for construction. And right now, here in Arizona, we are in a triple digit heat. I think we hit 117 or 118 last week. But the point is, once I get home from work, I am physically exhausted and even more so mentally exhausted. And rather than produce some lame, uninteresting content that you could find anywhere else on YouTube, I want to make sure that my videos are informative, factually correct, and as I've said before, more importantly, intellectually stimulating. So if I go off air for a while, that's why, especially during this brutal summer Arizona heat. So here's the really bad news. I actually recorded a second podcast with Don, as you guys already know from the very first podcast, and another guest, and it was a review of John McWhorter's his book, The Elect. However, the camera on the guest recorded the entire hour and a half footage, but the camera that was recording me only recorded 17 minutes and 20 seconds. Words cannot express the amount of anger and frustration that I felt once I discovered what happened. And that once again is on me. So the good news is that podcast 2 has been rescheduled, and we're actually going to review a different book this time, which will be Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility. Now, I know that I'm late to the party once again on reviewing this book, and I know that it's been out there for a while. However, I want to get out what I feel is a much needed Native American indigenous perspective on this book, because this concept and the ideas in that book, I believe, need to be challenged. Contrary to what many naive, progressive individuals may think, Robin DiAngelo does not speak for everyone or every minority group or every non-white individual. There exists so much divergence, so much diversity of opinion, especially amongst indigenous people, that it baffles me that so many people have fallen for this snake oil that DiAngelo has been selling. That's all I'll say for now. So hopefully my two guests will be ready to shoot something, hopefully in the next 2 weeks, and we can tackle this book together. And the last thing I want to mention before we actually get to the topic of inflation is that after speaking to some of my friends, they made a couple of really good suggestions that I'm actually going to incorporate starting with this video, which is both to shorten the length of these videos into smaller, more easier digestible segments. So no more 45-minute videos, which to be honest was exhausting. And that way I can get more content out sooner. And the other suggestion was to make the information more palatable to the layperson. Now, my channel is for everyone, and I mean everyone to watch, but my channel is called Native Liberty. And I want to make sure that I'm also reaching that audience, my fellow natives. I want everyone to be able to tune into my channel and be able to follow along and not feel like they need to grab a dictionary every time I speak, which was one of the constructive criticisms I received. Now, I realize that there's a fine line between dumbing something down, which is not what I'm going to do, and also unnecessarily overly complicating things, which I view as a failure, not upon the student or learner, but upon the teacher. So I'm going to strive to make things a lot more understandable, starting with this video. Now, why is this disclaimer important? It's important because I had originally written up about 40-something pages on inflation and was going to record a bunch of hour-long videos that went down into the very history and minutia of inflation. But then I realized that in order for me to do that, I'd pretty much have to teach basic microeconomic theory and incorporate bits of economic history into the mix. And this project just grew and grew and grew. And I realized something about myself, that I can be too much of a perfectionist when it comes to intellectual matters, and that I need to constantly remind myself that perfection can be the enemy of the good. So I scrapped everything and I'm just focusing upon the economic phenomenon of inflation itself from the point of view of a very basic layman's perspective or level. So with that being said, this video is going to be a short preface or prolegomena, which just means a short introductory or preliminary statement about my economic beliefs and influences and the economic school of thought that I hold to. Some of the economic concepts we'll be discovering in this series, and how inflation impacts all of us, but specifically Indian country especially. So with all that being said, let's get to it. So, first off, I am heavily influenced by what is called Austrian economics and the school of thought that centers around the Austrian tradition, going back to Karl Menger, Eugene von Bauerich, Ludwig von Mises, F.A. Hayek, Murray Rothbard, Hans Hermann Hoppe, Jesus Huerta de Soto, Peter Klein, Peter Betke, Sean Rittenauer, Gary North, Guido Holzman, Robert Murphy, Tom Woods, and a whole slew of other top-notch Austrian economic scholars and academics, also from George Mason University and the Mises Institute. Now, I've always been, since I was a kid, a proponent of the free market. Before I could even articulate why I favored the free market, it just made sense to me. I always felt intuitively that human beings should be able to freely trade and exchange with other free human beings without any government interference or intervention. Now, with that being said, the free market is not the same thing as what we have today, which is this mongrel mixed economy where the government picks winners and losers, or what is termed crony capitalism. A free society of free people doesn't need the paternalistic hand of the state to make decisions for them. Now, because this is an economic video and not a political philosophy video, I won't go into my position on the role of government, at least not yet. So because of my fondness for the free market, I gravitated in my youth towards what is called the Chicago School of Economics. And the biggest influence at that time was Milton Friedman and his books Capitalism and Freedom and Free to Choose, which he wrote with his wife, Rose Friedman. And the second economist that heavily influenced me and came out of the Chicago School was, of course, Thomas Sowell. And I have I think 10, maybe 12, maybe 15 books of his on a shelf over there. And he is responsible for single-handedly destroying, with his intellectual firepower of a mind, any inkling I may have held onto that government is an economic force for good in the economy. However, with that being said, the Chicago School's economic methodology, their way of studying economic phenomena and monetary theory, never sat comfortably with me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I've never viewed economics as having predictive power or approximate predictive power, as Friedman put it. But I view economics as a science as only having explanatory power. And it wasn't until the 2008 housing crisis or Great Recession that I providentially stumbled upon Austrian economics, and they simply applied the immutable laws of supply and demand to money, or the monetary unit in any society, which completely made sense to me and cleared up so much confusion that I was like, how did I not see this? And it was their focus upon the individual, or what is sometimes called methodological individualism, as the starting point for economic analysis that made sense to me. And so much of what passes for macroeconomic theory today, I believe, especially the neo-Keynesian variety, is simply alchemy. And that most economic journals today are full of elitist, self-serving, Gnostic garbage that, instead of revealing and explaining economic reality, obscures it. And this unhealthy relationship that exists between economists and the government is because John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s provided a theoretical justification for government to spend and print money in the belief that this pain-free solution would smooth out what he thought was the free market's volatile business cycle of booms and busts. Thus, the birth of the belief that the economy can somehow be controlled and manipulated from the top down and engineered by a group of Harvard or MIT economists. And what no one picks up on, at least not that I've seen, except the Austrians, is that this belief in Keynesian economics also saw the birth of this cozy relationship between politicians who are always eager for re-election and government-appointed economists who favored this new Keynesian economic worldview, and the state-run institutions that gained in prestige who produced these types of economists favorable to this outlook. And what was set in place was this very quid pro quo culture. Those economists, academics, and institutions who favored government spending received the highest appointments, grants, and endowments, which led to economic departments employing only those economists favorable to a Keynesian economic model. What I'm saying is basically this, that most economists today are simply statists who have never questioned their own economic belief system because it is such a part of the air they breathe so as to be unnoticeable. And those economists that hold to economic theories outside of the so-called mainstream are viewed either with contempt or looked upon as kooks, cranks, or economic relics of a pre-modern, pre-scientific time. And it's this overarching mainstream view of economics that influences most modern interpretations of inflation today, and in the process has obscured not only the proper definition of inflation, but its deleterious effects upon society. So in this series, I'm going to try and rediscover a proper definition of inflation using Austrian economics and unpack such vital concepts such as the proper genetic causal approach to understanding inflation, why defining inflation is important, who gains from this misidentification, who is responsible for inflation, who benefits from inflation, Gresham's law, the Cantillon effect, ABCT or Austrian business cycle theory, time preference, and the social consequences of inflation, such as the effect of inflation upon entrepreneurs, especially indigenous entrepreneurs, who already lack many of the economic incentives necessary for wealth creation. Who is hurt most from inflation? Its impact upon the inculcation of virtue, its impact upon the youth, especially indigenous youth, its impact upon the elders, its artificial raising of time preference, and how inflation insidiously undercuts tradition and culture. And lastly, how monetary inflation at its core is based upon deceit. So with that being said, I'll see you in the next video. Non duco duco, I am not led, I lead.